Welcome to Michigan Reimagined, a Spotlight podcast. And here's your host, Chris Buck.
So the state of Michigan is working tirelessly to attract new companies and with it, jobs by the thousands. As a state with flat population base in the recent decades, the conversation has turned to housing. Most agree we need more and a wider variety, but how many of what kind of housing do we actually need? So here to talk about a recently completed study for Mid-Michigan is the Deputy Director of the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, Nicole Baumer. Welcome back to the show, Nicole.
Thanks so much for having me back, Chris. Good to see you.
You've always got good content, and I see things come across the wire, and I'm like, it's time to get Nicole on to tell us, so I don't have to read. I can just have you tell us what actually came out of this
Taking the easy
study.
way out.
Yes, exactly, right? So it's, for those not familiar with Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, what is your core mission? What do you guys do?
So the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, also known as Tri-County, has been around for a long time. Since the 50s, we're very behind the scenes, quasi-government, but we kind of liaison between local, states, and federal level governments to get funding in three core areas, so transportation, the environment, and community development. Housing is one of those things that touches all of it. It drives everything.
Right.
So it's a particularly near and dear part of our mission. So getting that funding, coordinating projects, and working with locals.
So the housing topic obviously has come up, right? It's like we're Michigan's getting a lot of success. We already had what I think is a housing shortfall or a lack of variety. But now that we start landing, the $3 billion and 2,500 jobs here and another, 1,000 jobs over there and 50 jobs here, all of a sudden you're like, hopefully we're not just having people change jobs. We're going to drive inbound population growth as a state. And we need places for these people to live. So clearly Tri-County heard the message that housing is a problem. How do you begin the process of figuring out what we actually need?
Well, I would say for starters, several years ago, actually in 2015, we had worked with the Greater Lansing Housing Coalition, which is now defunct, to complete an affordable housing study. We've worked with Michigan State University students. We've worked with a lot of folks over the years just historically, but it was always about affordability. So we really wanted to flip the script when it comes to this study in particular and this assessment. And that's where we started in the first place. And it's not necessarily about affordability, but attainability. The idea that we need to look regionally, and our local governments are making decisions about developments and about these big developments with new employees that you're talking about just now. But they're not looking at the regional scope. It's kind of like roads. Nobody cares who owns the road. They just care it gets fixed, right? Right. Housing is very similar, where people don't care that they live in Delta Township and drive downtown Lansing to work, or they live downtown and they visit, their grandparents in Clinton County. They just want to be able to get there and have a place to live that they can attain reasonably. So less about, breaking the stigma, I think, is a lot of the narrative about affordable housing, low income, subsidized. It doesn't matter your economic class. Housing is an issue everywhere. So that's really our first approach, is angling it.
And so home builders, I would imagine, would want to have somebody do a study to say, okay, whether it's DeWitt or Okemos or Grand Blanc or Grand Ledge, the other
Close
Grand,
enough.
wrong county. But you just, where is their need? What can I be assured will be successful? They got to get lending. I'm sure they do their own kind of micro studies once they get pointed in the right direction. But am I correct in thinking that these studies are important to kind of disseminate to the building community to say, we've done the study and here's what's needed and how many and where? And so
I think the answer to that question, but 100%. We know that, what we're doing first and foremost is to support our local communities in making those decisions.
Right.
But the reality is we have had public, private, and nonprofit partners through the entire process. We know that financial institutions as lenders are a huge part of this conversation. And we know private developers and what they have the capacity to do is a huge part of this conversation. So yes, very long story short, private entities, home builders, et cetera, realtors, incredibly interested in the data.
Right.
And it's kind of it's a win-win for everybody because we all need the data, whether you're government or private.
So what did the data tell us?
So I think there's a few key takeaways, none of which will probably sound super surprising, but to actually make development choices is a huge step forward for our region. Of note is probably not a huge surprise, aging in place. We recognize that folks are, as they're getting older, they're going to want a different type of housing, and that's going to change demand, and it's going to change what our traditional patterns for development have been. We see that in a lot of other areas as well, but housing is what also drives other types of development. Quite frankly, it's holistic. Kids who have housing insecurity are more likely to have health issues or educational issues. So it is very holistic. So that's a key trend that we saw. Other obvious one, mismatch in demand versus what's being supplied. Some of that conversation is that really tough, sticky side where we need to figure out why that's happening. And we can have our hunches. Everything's anecdotal.
Right.
The developers will tell us. We're pretty confident. But the reality is we have an issue with the missing middle, which is basically a fancy way of saying that middle class, low-income middle class is not being provided for from an infrastructure standpoint. And it's how do we incentivize? That is the question, right? At the heart of this.
Right.
How do we incentivize that type of building? I would also say a lot of the conversation was outside of infrastructure and the data focused on programs and services. We have a lot of organizations that already do amazing work in our region, but it might just not be regional. It doesn't cross those municipal boundaries for whatever reason, whether it's capacity or funding eligibility at the federal level. So figuring out how we ramp up our current programs and services, financial literacy, homeowner education, things of that nature is a huge part of the conversation. So unsurprisingly, all of that feeds into demand, as you've already touched on.
Right.
We're looking at somewhere between 18 and 30,000 units in demand just over the next 20 years to account for, depending on the numbers that you look at, 30 to 60,000 just in resident population growth. That's not including, ironically, the current demand that's pent up for new developments that are happening and placing those workers. So a lot to unpack, but you can kind of take away that we're just not providing what is the true demand for our population demographics.
And that's interesting because, when I sit and think about housing and drive around mid-Michigan, you see two types of development projects happening. You see the high rise, apartment complexes in the city, kind of in the cool parts of town, for a lot of people. And then you see some subdivisions, being created and new homes, and they're all, in the $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 price range. So you have the true suburban, old school neighborhood subdivision, and then you have the dense downtown walkable community stuff. But there's a bigger need than that. So if you talk to a developer and just say, we're building this and we're building that, but we need a bunch of stuff here in the middle, like what's the barrier? Like, what do they tell you is the reason why they can't build some of the types of or they're choosing not to build the types of housing that the study shows that we need? So
I'd say we're kind of in a unique situation just timing wise, because we did conduct this just in the past year, which means that we're getting some pandemic data. Okay. And it's very preliminary. Obviously, we're going to see trends over the next tens of years, impacts from the pandemic. First and foremost, the thing that we hear is just the financial incentives in general, what it costs and what the return on investment is. Luxury, market rate, et cetera, those have a great return on investment. And so it's not as hard to build those. Even subsidized, though they have their own issues financially and from a regulation standpoint at the local level, those are still a little bit easier to do simply because you have a government assistance program that can help developers do those. But the missing middle, we're just not seeing those programs to support that at either the state, federal, or local level for that matter. So that's a huge challenge, is the financial incentives. But the pandemic side of things is inflation. We hear inflation, we see inflation with our own stuff, but we saw just between 2020 and 2021, a 17.5% increase in production costs. So we don't know how that's going to stay. From the builders I've spoken with through this process, they say once that cost goes up, kind of stays there. You might see a little fluctuation. So that's a whole new barrier that we now have to face. We're seeing it in transportation. All of the transportation projects for roads, bridges, et cetera, coming in 20% over cost or even more sometimes. So that's just kind of a new hurdle that we now have to recognize, both labor costs as well as physical manufacturing. Well, talking about investments and inflation and things of that nature, I'm going to pause and talk about today's show sponsor, because when it comes to managing your finances and planning for your future, I suggest you contact my friends at Wagner Financial. Whether you're just getting started, getting ready to retire, or anywhere in between, Wagner Financial can help you make smart financial decisions. Don't navigate a complex problem on your own. Wagner has the expertise to help you feel confident that you're making the right financial choices. Contact an advisor by calling 517-853-3367 or visit their website at wagnerfinancial.com. Because a lot of this is about
finances, right? You talk about return on investment, right? So if you're going to build a $400,000 or $500,000 home, I can imagine that kind of the higher the price point, the more likelihood that you're going to be able to build it for less and make a profit if you're a home builder. And if you put 800 people in a single building and get rent from, even if you have 10% vacancy, the sum of all of those rents will help defray the costs of that. So trying to build a $175,000 single family home doesn't work in today's environment with labor shortages and costs of the materials. Is that what you're hearing?
Hypothetically, a lot of it's yet to be determined. I mean, this is very new data, and quite frankly, the pandemic impacts are really new. Yep. From a lot of this process, we worked with some of those private developers, people like Gillespie, like Forsberg, and we do have some very savvy and thought-provoking and meaningful developers in our region that are looking for those solutions. But I think the other side of this isn't just building new; it's working with the existing stock that we have, and that was another key thing that we saw is condition is really hard to measure. You can get assessors who are privately doing that process and assessing literally the value and condition of homes. But harder for rental units. And if it's not consistent, particularly across the region, which it's not, shocker,
yep.
How do we measure condition? There aren't necessarily federal guidelines that talk about condition. Locals that can mean different things. So the greatest indicator is age, but we need better data related to that. Or alternatively, we need programs that can help us assess that data. So a lot of what we're seeing is that we may actually have the stock relatively that we need to help be part of the solution, but we need some serious investment into that current stock to make it livable. Okay. So it's not just building new that needs to be a part of the solution. So there's kind of a secondary script to this, and that's where a lot of those programs and services, especially from a human services standpoint, come into play. So nonprofits, I would expect, will be a key part of this conversation, informing what the demand is for the people that they serve in our own community.
So you prefacing it with that it's not a perfect science, but generally speaking, talk about the age of our existing housing stock and I guess the condition, because I didn't even consider that.
Yeah, of course. So in general, we aren't that far off from what I would call our peers from a community comparison standpoint, but the age is becoming a problem. If it's not already, which in some places it is more of a problem in the region than others. It's our average age is about built in the 1970s, so I believe it's 1972. And there's a lot of also creative things that we're seeing that maybe wasn't part of the data, but the DIY culture that we're seeing and some creative solutions to refurbish homes. And that's really not measurable, but to have a system that actually will work to support something that's substantial and up to, so shall we say, code, right. Low safety bar. So yeah, condition is about in the 70s, but we recognize that there's a lot of newer places in certain areas. So DeWitt area, you're going to see newer developments. Lansing area, you're going to see older developments, refurbished developments, et cetera. But that's not even considering some of the floodplain issues that we're seeing where you physically can't repurpose the uses for that housing stock for environmental concerns or other, logistical development concerns. So a very interesting issue to have.
And this Tri-County region, right? So we're talking Ingham, Eaton, and Clinton counties, right? So we've got City of Lansing, City of East Lansing. People have heard of Grand Ledge and Okemos and Hazlet and DeWitt, places like that. But we also have a lot of rural spaces, right? So I would imagine your statistics aren't just the Tri-County region needs this. It's got to talk a little bit about the range of what different, were you surprised to see that there was a difference in what is needed in different parts of our region?
I think that from the anecdotal feedback that we received, I wouldn't say that we were personally surprised, but the hard data is always a little shocking to swallow. Nothing groundbreaking, I think. A lot of the trends that you would think that you'd see, you see. So, areas that we've seen a bigger population growth in, there's been more development. Shocking. Yep. But one of the purposes of the study was to take a multifaceted approach. So we did look regionally throughout all three counties and did a lot of things like heat maps to see where major trends were affecting certain areas differently. But we also looked at specific submarkets. So there's a lot of fancy names that data collectors use for the submarkets, but your general gist is those that are fresh out of college, those who still live with their parents, those who, one might say aging in place, another might say silver foxes, whatever you want to call that group,
okay.
right?
I've seen those studies. Yep.
Yes, and so we did look at submarkets as it looks at a region as a whole, but we also looked at individual communities. So we identified the largest population townships and cities within our region, and did individual data analysis with key demographic changes and trends. If you asked me to memorize all of them, I'd say go to the experts. Can't wait to hear you read the study.
Right.
But it is very interesting just to see the difference in what we may say as a region our median X is, or our cost changes are, our demographics are, the demand is, compared to single communities. So we did take a multifaceted approach, both looking at a 3-county perspective as well as individual communities.
Got it. Because you not only want to take a look at what currently exists, but I guess you also want to try to figure out, where are people going to want to live? Mm-hmm. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So I guess I have two kind of things as we start getting close to wrapping up here. Where can people find this study? Is it available for public consumption yet, or is it kind of hot off the presses and you got to pretty it up before it's available?
We are literally hot off the press. We will be publicly announcing it in the next few weeks.
Okay.
All of the information about the study, if you want to learn more, is available at our website, mitcrpc.org/housing drives. For those that don't know, the title of the study is Housing Drives because housing drives everything. Development choices, health choices, education choices, etc. Transportation, another huge one. So it will be publicly released on there and available on our website, but we also anticipate really moving forward with working with the community on actually implementing findings of the study.
And that was the second thing is, okay, now we know what's needed and where it's all headed. How do you disseminate the information, and then what do you do to try to inspire people to build what's needed or fix what we have that needs to be fixed? And
inspire
all of
is such a great word. I love that. So as far as game plan goes, we got really lucky with the study because we organically, with the group that we worked with, ended up walking into kind of building a framework for a strategy to identify it. Originally, it was just supposed to be a pure data assessment, and we're really excited because we've already had partners at the table throughout this entire process, representing local businesses, entrepreneurship, human services. So you've got United Way and LEAP, Chamber, and so many other partners, Capital Housing Partnership, obviously. So we anticipate still using that group that we use to advise the development of this study, but move it more into an implementation phase and task force phase,
right?
Because they are the ones servicing ourselves. They're the ones building our homes. They're the ones providing programs for low-income households and cost-burdened individuals. So we do anticipate using them quite a bit and moving forward with a building a strategy standpoint where we identify kind of, I like to call it voluntolding.
Yeah.
Who's going to do what, and how are we all going to step up as a community to address some of these concerns?
Got it. All right. So you talked about the website, which is a little bit hard. It's Tri-County Regional Planning Commission.
Yep.
All those initials together. But if you just look at...
If you search Tri-County Housing Drives, it should come right up.
Perfect. Okay. And that's where people can go if they want to learn more. And then what else, maybe as we kind of close out here, is Tri-County working on outside of the housing front? Is there any other news that you're working on?
We are. We're actually working on a trails feasibility study to connect our beautiful Lansing River Trail to other communities and most notably state trails so we can get more competitive funding. We're doing a transportation plan. We're rebooting yet again that we do all the time. And of course, implementing over $80 million just in this year alone of transportation projects. So we're quite busy.
So you're not bored?
No, not at all. Keeps us on our feet.
Well, I appreciate that even more so that you came and joined me here today, the Deputy Director of the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, Nicole Baumer. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.